They called him a man of God, a shepherd guiding his flock. But behind the pulpit, Pastor Jeremiah Tate was something far more disturbing. Every Sunday, his congregation hung on to his words, believing they were being fed spiritual nourishment. But in reality, they were being fed something far more horrifying. The women who trusted him, who prayed beside him, who mysteriously vanished without a trace, were never missing. They were consumed. He preached about sin while committing the most unholy act imaginable. He turned his church into a slaughterhouse. And his own wife, once the devoted First Lady, would be the one to uncover his secret. But by then, she was already on his menu. Faith. Trust. Blind devotion. We believe religious leaders exist to guide and protect us. But what happens when the man an entire congregation worships is hiding in unspeakable horror? When the most sacred place in the community becomes the darkest crime scene? The case of Pastor Jeremiah Tate isn't just about murder, it's about the horrifying realization that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they wear a collar and stand at the altar. You've just stepped into the dark side of devotion. Welcome to True Crime Exposed. Dropping cases, shocking twists, and stories that will leave you speechless, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, and make sure you stay with us until the end, because trust me, you won't believe what's coming next. From the outside looking in, Pastor Jeremiah Tate and Vanessa Tate were the embodiment of faith and love. Their marriage was held up as a shining example within Greater Hope Ministries, a thriving church in New York that attracted thousands of devoted worshipers every Sunday. Jeremiah, at 45, was the kind of pastor who could bring an entire room to tears with his sermons. His words carried weight, his presence commanded respect, and his charm made people feel like he truly understood their struggles. Vanessa, at 41, was the backbone of his ministry. She wasn't just the first lady of the church, she was a mentor, a guide, and a mother figure to many. Women in the congregation admired her, younger girls sought her wisdom, and struggling couples turned to her for guidance. Her kindness felt genuine because, to her, it was. She believed in her husband's mission, in the words he preached, and in the life they had built together. Their home was just as picture-perfect. A grand Victorian-style house a few blocks from the church, filled with elegant furnishings, family portraits, and scripture-covered walls. Every Sunday, they hosted lavish post-service dinners, inviting church members, community leaders, and struggling souls who needed comfort. Vanessa loved these gatherings. Feeding people was her way of spreading warmth and love. But while Vanessa was preparing meals for the congregation, Jeremiah was hunting for his next one. Behind his gentle smiles and wise words, he was hiding a monstrous secret. He wasn't just counseling troubled women. He was targeting them. The vulnerable, the lost, the ones who came to him in search of guidance, he made them feel safe, only to turn them into prey. The first time Vanessa sensed something was off was 2 years ago, when a young woman named Maya Brooks, a devoted member of the church, vanished. Maya had been a regular at their home, a frequent volunteer, and someone Vanessa had grown close to. She had confided in Vanessa about her struggles, and just weeks before she disappeared, Maya had told her she was considering leaving Greater Hope Ministries. She felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. Then, suddenly, she was gone. Jeremiah reassured everyone. She needed time away. Let's pray for her. And just like that, her absence became a whisper, lost in the noise of church activities and new faces filling the pews. But Maya wasn't the only one. Over the next 2 years, 3 more women vanished, always young, always struggling, always seeking guidance. Each time, Jeremiah offered the same excuse, the same comforting words, the same dismissive tone that made Vanessa push her concerns aside. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. And soon, she would have no choice but to face the horrifying truth. Vanessa had never been the type to snoop. She trusted Jeremiah completely. He was her husband, her spiritual leader, the man who had stood beside her for nearly 2 decades. When he came home late from the church, she assumed he was praying, preparing sermons, or counseling lost souls. He was a man of God, after all. But one night changed everything. Jeremiah had been more distant lately. More secretive. His late nights stretched longer, his excuses grew thinner, and Vanessa had started to feel something she never had before, unease. She walked into their church office to find his laptop sitting open on his desk, the glow of the screen casting eerie shadows against the walls. Jeremiah quickly rushed out of the house, leaving it unattended. She hesitated. She wanted to respect his privacy. But a nagging voice in her head, the same voice that had been whispering warnings for months, urged her forward. With trembling fingers, she nudged the mouse. The screen flickered awake, revealing an open chat room. The conversation at the top of the page made her stomach drop. She begged me to let her go. I told her begging makes the meat tender. Vanessa's heart pounded against her ribcage. What the hell was she reading? She scrolled further. You have to drain them first. The blood can ruin the flavor. How long do you let the body rest before cooking? Fresh is best. Nothing like a meal still warm from fear. Her hands turned ice cold as she processed what she was looking at. This wasn't fiction. These weren't just sick fantasies. She clicked on a file attached to one of the messages. A photo popped up on the screen. It was a woman. A woman she recognized. Maya Brooks. Or what was left of her. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Maya was tied to a metal table, her skin pale and lifeless, her eyes open in a frozen expression of terror. The timestamp on the image was from 2 years ago, the exact night Maya had disappeared. Vanessa slammed the laptop shut, her breathing ragged, her body shaking. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. Jeremiah wouldn't, he couldn't. But her mind raced back to the missing women from their congregation. The ones Jeremiah had reassured everyone had left for a fresh start. 4 women in total, Maya Brooks, Lillian Carter, Simone Evans, and Aisha Wells. Vanessa's stomach turned as another horrific realization hit her. Jeremiah loved to cook. He had always been unusually insistent on preparing the church's Sunday meals himself. It was something the congregation had laughed about, Pastor Tate's famous Sunday feasts. He would spend hours in the church's industrial kitchen, seasoning, slow roasting, making sure every meal was perfect. And then there was the odd, metallic smell that sometimes lingered in that kitchen. The way he never let anyone else touch the meat. The way he discouraged questions about his suppliers. The bile rose in Vanessa's throat. She stumbled back from the desk, clutching her chest as her lungs refused to pull in air. This was real. This was happening. She was married to a monster. Vanessa's fingers shook as she opened and scrolled through the laptop, the weight of the horrifying truth pressing against her chest like a vice. She forced herself to look, to really see what was in front of her. The chat logs were filled with gruesome details, but it was the names that made her blood run cold. 4 women. Each name sent a fresh wave of nausea crashing over her. Maya Brooks. Lillian Carter. Simone Evans. Aisha Wells. She knew these women. She had hugged them. Prayed with them. They had once filled the front pews, their hands lifted in worship, their voices echoing through the sanctuary. And then, one by one, they had vanished. Jeremiah had told the congregation they had moved on, that life had called them elsewhere. He had even led prayers for their well-being, urging the church to trust in God's plan when their families expressed concern. All lies. Vanessa's stomach churned as she dug deeper. The more she clicked, the more her world unraveled. Then, she found something far worse than the chat logs. Videos. Her breath hitched as she hesitated over the first file. Maya_B_07.avi. She clicked. The screen flickered to life. At first, it was just the church, dimly lit, empty, quiet. Then, a figure appeared. Jeremiah. Vanessa gripped the edge of the desk as she watched her husband lead Maya Brooks inside. The timestamp in the corner read 11:43 p.m., 2 years ago, the night Maya had left town. Vanessa's pulse pounded in her ears. Maya was smiling, laughing, clearly unaware of the danger. Jeremiah hugged her, whispered something in her ear, then led her toward the church's back rooms. Vanessa's vision blurred. She knew those back rooms. They weren't just for storage. They had a kitchen. She fast-forwarded. The next few minutes were pure horror. Maya's laughter turned to confusion. Then, to fear. She tried to leave, but Jeremiah blocked the door. His demeanor had shifted completely, no longer warm, no longer gentle. He was calm. Cold. Calculating. Then, a second figure stepped into the frame. Vanessa froze. It wasn't just Jeremiah. He had an accomplice. The video was dark, but there was no mistaking that familiar posture, that confident stride. Vanessa's chest tightened. It was someone who knew the church inside and out. Someone who knew how to move undetected. Someone who had access to every room, every schedule, every security blind spot. It was Deacon Robert Gray. A man Vanessa had trusted for years. Her body shook as she realized the full horror of what she was seeing. Jeremiah didn't work alone. Robert had been helping him choose victims. They had done this together. Tears blurred her vision as she scrolled through more videos, more evidence, more lives stolen. Jeremiah and Robert preyed on these women. Lured them in. Trapped them. And then, they had done something far worse than just taking their lives. They had fed them to the congregation. Vanessa's heart pounded as she stared at the screen, the grotesque evidence seared into her mind. Her fingers hovered over the laptop, desperate to act, desperate to run, but she wasn't thinking fast enough. A floorboard creaked. Her breath caught in her throat. Then came the sound she dreaded most, the front door unlocking, the familiar shuffle of shoes against the hardwood floor. Jeremiah was home. Her body stiffened. She snapped the laptop shut, yanked the charger from the wall, and forced herself to breathe normally. Footsteps approached the office. Slow. Unhurried. Then, his voice. Vanessa. You up? She swallowed hard and wiped her sweaty palms against her dress. Yeah, just finishing up some church notes, she called out, forcing a casual tone. The door swung open. Jeremiah stood in the doorway. His presence always carried weight, like an invisible force pressing down on the room. But tonight, something was different. He was still wearing his clerical collar, his black shirt tucked neatly into his slacks, but his eyes were locked onto her, unblinking. He took a step inside. Then another. What's wrong? He asked smoothly, tilting his head. Vanessa forced a smile. Nothing, nothing at all. She waved a hand at the desk, keeping her body angled in front of the laptop. Just tired. It's been a long day. Jeremiah's eyes flicked toward the laptop. A pause. A long pause. Then, he smiled. But not the kind that made her feel safe. You sure? He asked, his voice too calm, too measured. Vanessa knew that voice. It was the same voice he used when he comforted grieving families. The same voice that soothed frightened parishioners. But she knew the truth now, it was also the voice he used when he lured women to their deaths. I'm fine, Jeremiah, she said, forcing herself to yawn as if exhaustion, not terror, weighed her down. He nodded slowly, still watching her. Then, he turned just enough for her to see the fresh stain on his sleeve. Dark. Thick. Still wet. Her stomach dropped. Blood. Vanessa's throat went dry, but she didn't dare react. Had he just killed someone? Was there another woman in the back of the church right now, suffering the same fate as the others? She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from shaking. "You should get some rest," he finally said, his smile still in place. "We have a long day tomorrow." Vanessa nodded, forcing herself to play along. "Yeah, a long day." Jeremiah lingered for just a moment longer, just enough to make sure she wasn't lying. Then, he turned and walked away. She listened as his footsteps disappeared down the hall. She exhaled. Her hand trembled as she reached for the laptop. She had to go to the police. She had to get out of here. Vanessa pushed the laptop under her arm and moved toward the bedroom, her purse, her keys, she needed everything ready. But just as she reached for the doorknob, her phone lit up. A message. "Jeremiah, I'll lock up tonight. No need for you to get up." Her breath caught. She turned her head toward the front door. The deadbolt slid into place. Click. 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 The sound echoed in her bones. She wasn't just in danger. She was trapped. The night Vanessa Tate disappeared, no one knew the nightmare that had unfolded behind the doors of Greater Hope Ministries. It was a cold Sunday evening, just hours after Pastor Jeremiah Tate had delivered a powerful sermon about the dangers of temptation and the need for unwavering faith. His congregation, as always, hung on to his every word, unaware that their beloved pastor had already chosen his next sacrifice. His wife. Vanessa never showed up to Monday morning prayer service. By Tuesday, her absence was impossible to ignore. At first, Jeremiah kept his explanation simple: Vanessa had gone out of town to visit family. He told his church staff she was dealing with personal matters and needed time away. He even led a prayer for her, his voice steady, unwavering, dripping with false concern. But the ones who truly knew Vanessa, her closest friends, the women who had stood by her side for years, didn't believe it. Vanessa was many things, but secretive wasn't one of them. She would have told someone. She wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Days passed. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts sat untouched. And then, something strange happened. One of the church's longtime members, Deacon Harold Robinson, went to the basement kitchen to grab extra supplies for a community event. It was a place rarely used, mostly for storage and large catering preparations. But when he flicked on the light, something caught his eye. On the floor, just near the industrial sink, were small, dark stains. Blood. It wasn't a lot, just enough to seep into the cracks of the tile, enough to stain the grout, enough to make his stomach turn. Harold knelt down, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch it. It was dry. Had it been here before? Had someone spilled something? Or was it something worse? An uneasy feeling settled in his gut. Harold stood up, backed away, and without hesitation, called the police. When officers arrived, they expected nothing more than a routine check. Maybe an accident in the kitchen. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Maybe, hopefully, it was nothing. But the moment they stepped inside, that hope vanished. Something was off. The air was thick, the walls carried an unexplainable stench. Then, they found more. Small, splattered stains along the side of the freezer. A single earring wedged into the corner of the floor. A torn piece of fabric, deep burgundy, the same shade Vanessa had worn the last time anyone saw her. That's when he checked the church's security footage. And what they saw sent chills down their spines. The footage from that Sunday night told a story more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. 11:23 p.m., Vanessa appears on screen. She's moving fast, clutching her purse and Jeremiah's laptop against her chest. Her body language is tense, frantic, like she's running out of time. 11:25 p.m., she reaches the front door. She tugs at the lock. It won't budge. Click. 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 Her head jerks around. She knows she's trapped. 11:27 p.m. Jeremiah steps into view. He walks slowly, too slowly, his hands in his pockets. He's calm. Too calm. Vanessa takes a step back. Then another. They exchange words, there's no audio, but it's clear she's pleading. 11:29 p.m., she makes a run for it. She turns down the hall, her heels clacking against the floor, her figure a blur as she sprints toward the side exit. She almost makes it. 11:30 p.m., Jeremiah catches her. The struggle is violent. She thrashes. She fights. His hands wrap around her throat. She claws at his arms, her mouth open in a silent scream. 11:32 p.m., Vanessa goes limp. Jeremiah doesn't hesitate. He drags her lifeless body toward the basement. Then, he disappears from view. The moment detectives saw the footage, everything changed. The missing persons case turned into a full-scale murder investigation. With probable cause established, a search warrant was secured for Greater Hope Ministries, the towering megachurch where Jeremiah Tate had built his empire. What officers found inside would scar them forever. The industrial kitchen, where countless church luncheons, charity dinners, and Sunday feasts had been prepared, was ground zero. The freezer. Packed to capacity. But this wasn't ordinary meat. Each package was meticulously labeled, roast, chops, ground meat, with no indication that it once had a name, a face, a life. But forensic teams knew better. They ran tests. The results were beyond disturbing. Every package contained human remains. Some of it still had fingerprints. The bone fragments and the truth no one wanted to believe. It didn't stop there. In a hidden storage room adjacent to the kitchen, officers discovered a barrel filled with charred bone fragments. Hundreds of them. All belonging to women who had once sat in the pews of Greater Hope. It became clear. Jeremiah Tate wasn't just a serial killer. He was a butcher. And his congregation, unknowingly, horrifyingly, had been eating the very women they had prayed for. With the evidence stacked so high there was no way out, authorities moved in on Pastor Jeremiah Tate. He was arrested right at the pulpit, mid-sermon, in front of his congregation. Bibles hit the floor. Screams rang out. Some of his followers cried in disbelief. Others? They vomited on the spot as the news spread like wildfire. But the nightmare wasn't over. Because Jeremiah hadn't done it alone. Investigators quickly uncovered his accomplice, church deacon Robert Gray, a longtime friend and trusted figure in the congregation. Robert had helped select the victims. Helped dispose of the remains. Helped turn faith into something unholy. The truth was out. And the entire nation was watching in horror. The courtroom was packed. Every seat taken, every eye fixed on the man who once preached about salvation but had instead led his congregation straight into darkness. Jeremiah Tate sat at the defense table. For weeks, the trial had gripped the nation. News outlets swarmed the courthouse, the public unable to look away from one of the most horrifying cases in New York history. The idea that a trusted pastor, a man who had baptized babies, counseled families, and led thousands in prayer, had been murdering his own congregants and serving their remains at Sunday service was unthinkable. But the prosecution didn't deal in speculation. They had evidence, more than enough to bury him. The lead prosecutor, Rachel Whitmore, stood before the jury, her voice unwavering. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of madness. This was premeditated, calculated, and deliberate. Jeremiah Tate did not just take lives, he desecrated them, violated them, and convinced himself he was acting on behalf of God. She turned toward the defendant, her expression cold. The only place this man belongs is behind bars for the rest of his life. The jury hung on to every word. But in reality, they didn't need convincing. The evidence alone was damning. The prosecution laid out a case so horrifying that even the most seasoned investigators admitted to losing sleep over it. The videos, grainy footage pulled from Jeremiah's personal laptop, showed him luring women into the church after hours. Each clip played in court was more disturbing than the last. The victims, 4 women, all members of Greater Hope Church, could be seen entering the building, trusting, unaware of what awaited them. None of them ever walked out. And then came the most chilling part. The kitchen footage. It was grainy, low-lit, almost surreal. Jeremiah chopping, seasoning, preparing meals, the kind his congregation had eaten every Sunday. People in the gallery gasped, some running out in tears. The victims' families sat in silent horror, their faces pale, drained of life. But the evidence didn't stop there. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains of all 4 missing women were found in the church's industrial freezer. Forensic experts matched the bloodstains to each of them. And then, there were the witness testimonies. Church members came forward. Parishioners spoke about their pastor's sudden interest in preparing church meals himself, the way he refused to let anyone into the kitchen. One woman recalled a conversation where Jeremiah casually joked about sacrifices being necessary for true faith. At the time, they dismissed it as just a strange metaphor. Now, they knew better. Despite the mountain of evidence, Jeremiah refused to admit guilt. Instead, he took the stand, a decision that stunned legal experts. Most expected him to plead insanity or at least show remorse. He did neither. These were not murders, he told the jury, his voice eerily calm. They were offerings. The Lord called upon me to purify the unfaithful, to bring them into his kingdom through sacrifice. He spoke without shame, without hesitation. I did not kill them. I freed them. The jury stared at him in disgust. It was clear. This was not a man suffering from a momentary lapse in judgment. He wasn't overcome by rage or caught in a crime of passion. This was cold. Calculated. He believed in what he did. His defense team scrambled to paint him as delusional, a man who had lost touch with reality. They claimed he was suffering from religious psychosis, that his mind had been warped by extreme theological beliefs. But the prosecution shut that down immediately. Jeremiah hadn't been out of his mind, he had been in complete control. The chat logs, the planning, the cleanup, it all pointed to careful, methodical murder. And then came the final betrayal. Robert Gray, Jeremiah's longtime deacon and trusted friend, turned on him. Facing his own set of charges, Robert cut a deal with prosecutors in exchange for a lesser sentence. His testimony was the final nail in Jeremiah's coffin. It was never about faith, Charles admitted on the stand. It was about power. He enjoyed it. The control. The secrecy. The fact that no one suspected a thing. When asked why he participated, Charles's face fell with shame. Because he made me believe it was God's will. Because I was weak. And because I was afraid of what would happen if I said no. The verdict, no mercy. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with the only verdict possible, guilty on all charges. 4 counts of first-degree murder. Conspiracy to commit murder. Desecration of human remains. And the sentencing? Life in prison. No parole. Jeremiah showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He simply folded his hands, his expression eerily neutral. Even as the families of his victims sobbed. Robert Gray, his accomplice, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Greater Hope Church was permanently shut down. Its doors sealed, its name forever associated with horror. Members of the congregation struggled to comprehend how they had been so blind. How they had followed a man who had been preaching salvation while committing the unthinkable. Vanessa disappeared from the public eye, trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered. She had once stood beside Jeremiah, believing in his mission. Now, she was left with nothing but the wreckage of his sins. And as for Jeremiah, he was sent to a maximum security prison, where he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of his power, his pulpit, and his congregation. But even in prison, one thing remained certain. The world would never forget his name. We trust our religious leaders to guide us, to protect us, to be the moral compass of our communities. But the case of Jeremiah Tate proves that even the holiest of men can be hiding the darkest of secrets. For years, he stood in front of his congregation, delivering sermons about sin, while committing the most unthinkable evil behind closed doors. His wife discovered the truth too late. And by then, she was already on his menu. But what do you think? Was Jeremiah always a monster, or did something push him over the edge? And how did an entire congregation miss the warning signs? Let us know in the comments. This is True Crime Exposed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more shocking cases. See you next time.